Right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. And good afternoon and welcome to the Poverty Solutions Summit Investing in Black Futures panel. My name is Shekeria Brown, and I'm honored to be here today moderating this panel. I currently serve as the U.S. Southeast Market Manager for JPMorgan Chase's Corporate Responsibility Community Engagement Team, where I work with nonprofit organizations focused on economic inclusion and serving communities through advocacy, thought leadership, and direct service. JPMorgan Chase's Corporate Responsibility Team leverages the firm's business expertise and resources, its policy advocacy, data, and philanthropic investments to help create an inclusive recovery and advance racial equity, primarily in 4 priority focus areas of the firm. That includes careers and skills, financial health and wealth creation, community development, and business growth and entrepreneurship. Prior to joining the firm, I also served as the executive director for the South Florida Community Development Coalition, also based in Miami, where we focused on nonprofit capacity building, affordable housing, and community and economic development, both policies and programs. Today, just also want to indicate, as I am here with JPMorgan Chase, but just know that the opinions that I may express as part of this conversation are my own. Just required to disclaim that. And I have the honor of introducing our panelists today. Looking forward to this conversation. At first, I want to recognize Shamar. Shamar Bibbins is a Senior Program Officer with the Kresge Foundation's Environment Program, where her grant making supports policies and programs that help cities combat and adapt to climate change while advancing racial and economic equity. She manages Kresge's Climate Change, Health, and Equity Initiative. This national initiative is a partnership between Kresge's environmental and health programs to address the intersecting imperatives of accelerating action on climate change and reducing health disparities. Her grant making also supports climate adaptation field building efforts in the US and initiatives that advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in the environmental, nonprofit, and philanthropic fields. Shamar joined Kresge in 2014, bringing a history of experience advancing environmental and economic justice in marginalized communities and a commitment to action on climate change. Also joining us today is Rebecca Fishman Lipsey, who is president and CEO of the Miami Foundation, a $350 million foundation focused on solving the issues that matter most to the future of Miami. Before joining the foundation, Rebecca founded Radical Partners, a social impact accelerator that incubates and accelerates ventures that solve civic and community challenges. During her tenure, they helped scale over 100 social impact ventures, ranging from sea level rise to music access. Rebecca served a 4-year term on the Florida Board of Education and began her career as a teacher. So just to know how this will proceed, I'm going to ask a few questions. We're going to have a conversation with Shamar and Rebecca. There'll be approximately 15 minutes reserved for Q&A at the end, but I want to invite you, as you are listening to the conversation, to please type in the chat and we'll be able to answer those questions. So let's get this conversation started. Shamar and Rebecca. So we know that organizations led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color are often smaller, on the front lines of solving community issues and providing service delivery, yet more than often they're under-resourced. We know disparities continue to exist in philanthropy and that there are still significant funding streams going to white-led organizations that are still working in primarily BIPOC communities, even as these communities continue to remain disproportionately impacted by most of the pressing issues of our time, including climate change, and as we've seen in the last 12 months, COVID-19. What can foundations and philanthropic entities do to address this disparity? Or can you share with us what each of your organizations may already be doing to address this?
Shamar, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Shekeria, and good to see you, Rebecca, and good afternoon, everyone. Really excited for this conversation. I think as I think about that question, what can we do, right, as foundations and philanthropic institutions? I think the first thing that is critically important, and it may seem like a no-brainer, but I think we have to have a commitment to racial equity. I think our institutions actually have to have a commitment. Diversity and inclusion and all facets of equity are critically important. And we need them all, but we need to actually center racial equity, and not until racial equity is a value and both a strategy of our institutions. Until that happens, I don't think we could actually take the pathway necessary to actually then begin to do all the things that it requires to support BIPOC communities, and meaning to both institutionalize racial equity and operationalize it right within our institutions. So I think it first has to be a commitment and a value and a strategy. I feel like there are many things, right? Like there are many things our organization is doing, and I'm really proud of that. So our environment program at Kresge is, since 2014, has been focused at the intersection of cities, climate change, and equity, racial equity specifically. However, before 2014, that was not the case. And so we've been on a journey ourselves for certain. And prior to 2014, our environment program was a very traditional climate program, very strong program. Nationally recognized, really strong on climate adaptation, strong on climate mitigation. Both were a bit siloed. And at that time, there wasn't a strong expression of equity in the portfolio. So, the team before my time in 2014 took a really specific learning journey, which was really board directed at that time, to really be in line with the North Star of the foundation, to really expand opportunity for low wealth communities in US cities. But it wasn't until 2014 when the environment program actually had a strategy that centered equity, which is our strategy now. Could we actually do all the things that we're doing, which includes having a racial equity program for our grantees, which includes investments that have been increased to BIPOC communities since that time. And I can go on and tell you different things that we're doing, but it was that strategy that had to be in place that actually prompted us to do our grant making in a very different way, that allowed us to flip the frame, if you will, to actually invest in BIPOC communities and community-led organizations working on climate, and actually led to my hiring at the foundation, because it was a very different way in a different program and different investments in how we were going to execute our investments, which also required different leadership to come on the team. So I'll stop there, but I think that is what I would say is the starting place.
Thank you, Shamar. And Rebecca?
It's awesome, Shamar, to hear about the journey you all have been on. I have a lot of respect for your foundation and for you and your work. I'll say, before I dive into thoughts about this question, I just have to compliment Catalyst on the inclusivity of this platform. I'm really impressed. Beth, it's awesome to have you here. I know it's probably strange to compliment yourself inside, but it's awesome to have you here and to see how many options there were to change this interface, to adapt, to make sure that this is inclusive for everyone who's watching. And so just thought I'd be remiss to not even mention it at the start of a conversation about a different kind of inclusivity. So Catalyst, we see you, you're setting the bar for our community, and appreciate what you're doing. In terms of the question that you asked, Shekeria, it's a really important question. And I think the right place to start for me is to ground in the data. There was a study that came out a few years back that cited that less than 1% of foundation dollars, I think it was like 0.6% of foundation dollars, were going to organizations that are led by Black women. Like, how is that happening? What are we valuing on the foundation side? I think we have put in this past generation a lot of value on theories of change and logic models, on board relationships, on the ability to write good essay responses to specific questions, impact reporting. There's certain things that have become catchphrases and application processes that have been highly valued, while lived experience of the issue at hand has not been the number one thing on the list, or even at times number 4 or 5 thing on the list for foundations to be looking at when deciding where to invest funds. And I think we need to be flipping the model to be understanding that those who are closest to an issue are the experts of their own lived experience, and that we need to be honoring that in our solutions. If we were thinking about solving for gender inequity, and then we looked to see that 99% of the dollars trying to address gender equity were going to male-led organizations, we would laugh and think about how ludicrous that seems. And so when we're thinking about addressing a variety of inequities in our community, to see that 99% of the funds are going the way that they're going, it just, it begs into question our values and our own process. And I heard a thought from a colleague across the country last month that really stuck with me. She said, it's as if the philanthropic community decided that white-led organizations were better run and had a greater impact, and then we made it true because of the way that we funded. And that if we're giving token grants to leaders of color and then more substantial grants to white-led organizations, it's as if we've prophesized the inequity, and then we have funded the perpetuation of that inequity in our dollars. And so on our end, it started looking at our data and trying to understand where the pipeline issue was. Are we not valuing the right things in our application process and our selection process? Who are the decision makers? What is the barrier to entry? Are we not promoting and communicating well enough about opportunities? And we saw gaps at each step in the process, which now both on our racial equity funding side, but also in all of our grants, is something that we're thinking a lot about.
If I could just add to that, I think that's right, Rebecca. Absolutely, the value proposition, and the saying goes, you look at your budget and see what you're prioritizing, and that shows you what you value, right? Yes. And so when I think about the investment that we made, I talked about 2014 when we changed our grant making strategy. One of the first things we launched was an initiative called our Climate Resilience and Urban Opportunity Initiative, which is how I got to know and work with Catalyst Miami, who was a part of that initiative. And, one of the reasons, or one of the ways in which we came to do that work, is because we know that, particularly from the climate perspective, it's who do we see as climate experts? And so that particular program was designed to, again, flip the frame of not going to bigger green organizations to help them, build their capacity around equity, which is important. But we had an opportunity to drive the dollar directly to those who were closest to the problem on the ground doing the work, and help elevate, right? Not that they're not experts. We know they're experts because they have lived experience. They're experiencing the impacts of climate change and all the other disparities every single day. But to elevate their voice so they can actually be seen as climate experts. And that's a real big part of how we do our work at Kresge and our environment team, to really change the field and change who people see as experts, who they value as folks who actually should be sourced and invested in equally as others. So thank you for saying that.
Absolutely, great points, both of you. So, just to continue on the conversation, I mean, this last 10, 12 months has been, one that's just been, everything that you can think of has happened and been highlighted. And I go back to the summer of, obviously, 2020, and sometimes it's been referred to as the summer of racial reckoning in this country. With that summer, what we've seen immediately after has been like this sparked and a significant increase in funding commitments to advance racial equity since that time. What steps can be taken to further commit to equitable investments and supporting organizations advancing racial equity? I think you both started to touch upon that, but how do we go further in ensuring that these commitments coming forward now, particularly in these last recent months, are equitable, and that they are truly supporting organizations advancing racial equity? And that's to both of you.
Yeah, I can jump in there. We as an institution, so I talked a little bit about how we've been, tackling this in the environment program, but as an institution, we are on a journey as well and have been. And I think, you know, equity work is never done, right? It's a continual piece and it's a continual learning. And I think it's really important that we really begin to think about how do we move beyond, you know, checking the box? How do we move beyond, you know, in responding to a moment, right? It surely is a moment. But when we think about the communities that we work in, right, the disparities have been there for forever, right, and for a long time because of the structural inequities and the systemic racism in our country. And so I remember a conversation, you know, after in 2016 with our board and with our team, and had to, you know, remind folks that yes, this was a moment, and the communities have been impacted for a long time. So how do we get beyond just thinking about response and just moments and really move towards more systemic and more long-term funding to support communities in a way, like yours mentioned, Shekeria, that actually help improve everyday lives? And so I think one of the ways we can really do that is by, again, we have to institutionalize and operationalize what we mean by supporting BIPOC communities. It's not just one thing. So in response to the events this past summer, Kresge as an institution, you know, we launched a racial equity cohort, which is 60 different organizations across the country, everything from Movement for Black Lives to very small organizations in place who are advancing racial equity. And I mean, huge investment. But we wouldn't have been ready to answer the moment had we not been doing our work for the past 4 or 5 years. And what that work looked like is for our institution to really move beyond, you know, again, just a diversity frame or just an inclusion frame or just a broader equity frame to really do the work. And that includes continued work, everything from board engagement to, you know, hiring Race Forward to come in and work with our executive team and our staff, to really touching every single person around the organization to come together to create shared space, to have tough conversations, right? To, you know, to be uncomfortable. If you're not uncomfortable, you're not doing the work. And so, you know, we've done everything from creative pilots, which included teams across the foundation from our program team assistants to our administrative staff, all the way up to our executive staff, to really look at every function of the foundation, from our investments to our vendors, to pilot different projects that we could then move forward and deepen our work, you know, in our commitment to our grantees. So not just on the investment side, but from all of our operational side. So I say all that to say, you know, we've been learning along the way, but we wouldn't have been ready to, I don't think, respond to the moment of this past summer in the way we were able to, had we not done, we probably would have done something, right? You know, but the way in which it was a no-brainer of like, absolutely, we have to meet the moment and this is how we're gonna do it, right? And the work just continues. I mean, we're learning along the way and we're continuing to push each other and stretch each other. But there's a culture now, and there's different instincts, right, that people are asking. And I think that's the place we want to get to. We want to get to a place where everyone collectively has the instincts to ask the right question, right? Do we have the right people at the table? Is this the right approach? So, you know, lots of conversation internally in our institution, like, we're not moving fast enough. You know, people want to move faster, and that's true. But I think you have to meet people where they are as well and bring people along, but also not be afraid to push. And that's one of the things that I think we can't support our communities if we're not doing that work in an authentic way in our institutions.
So if I were to dig in a layer into something you just said, you asked, you know, are we asking the right questions? Are we bringing the right people to the table? There's a real humility to that kind of approach. I feel like I've seen a bit of an imbalance in the funder relationships with nonprofit organizations, as if funders are decision makers, they have access to capital, and then nonprofits are grateful recipients. And so balancing that equation and understanding with humility that if we are partners in community impact, you are doing the impact, we are funding the impact, we are working with each other, we each gain from this equation. I cannot have impact without you, and you want resources from me in order to amplify your impact. To kind of to level set a bit there. I remember a few years ago, before I was at the foundation, I was working with social innovators, and I went to a pitch meeting where there were a bunch of funders there, and there's an organization that was working on a solution for communities that were unbanked. So populations that were not putting their dollars into banking institutions and wanted to find opportunities to help them to save and to leverage their dollars better. And the funding group that was there was multiple foundations and investors couldn't get past the concept of the fact that there was an unbanked population. Like this, they weren't familiar with the term unbanked or with the need at hand, and they passed on the opportunity because there was nobody on the leadership teams involved in the decision making that had lived experience with the problem. And I think it calls upon us as institutions in these moments not just to say the right thing and to have a very well-designed statement of inclusion and to launch a fund, but to ask ourselves the questions that you just asked, which is like, do we have the right people advising us at the table? Do we have the right people decision making? Are we asking the right questions? Are we setting the parameters here in a way that's actually going to lead to an equitable conclusion? Or are we just patting ourselves on the back that we checked the box to launch a fund because we know we're supposed to do that right now? So I think like part of this really is about like the deep work, the reflection. You all have had some running space. You've been working on this since 2014. There's a lot of people who are realizing it's time to move, and they're putting feet on the ground, and they're also executing at the same time. And there's some humility involved in trying and then listening, getting tough feedback, integrating that feedback, and doing better. But we have to be brave in this moment. This is a courageous moment for leaders to be willing to say, like, I'm going to do the best that I know, and then I know that I'm going to get called out for the places where I fall short, and to be ready for that and not to hold back from doing out of fear of not doing enough.
Yeah, that is so right on. One of the things that we do, well, for the two initiatives that I manage and across our foundation, actually in different program teams, is have advisory committees, right? That are led by, grantee partners, experts from the field. I don't know how I would do my work if I wasn't taking the lead and listening to to our grantee partners. I mean, it would just, I don't know how I would do my work. I think we have to have humility. We have to listen, and we have to take the lead on what's happening in the field. Now, there's also a transparency to that because you're not going to be able to do all the things, right? But it's important that, for me, I think for our team, that when we're making strategy, developing strategy, thinking and learning together, that we're doing it in partnership with, because I don't know how you could actually move and support, the communities we serve without having input. And so our advisory committees have been extraordinarily helpful, and they're humbling. I would leave our advisory committee meetings like, oh my gosh, there's so much information, but it's the real-time feedback from experts actually doing the work, folks doing the work, grantees doing the work. And it is a lot of humility in that, a lot of listening, a lot of gut checking. But I feel like it's the way in the path of how we have to do our work better, and be honest about what you can and what you can't do, because there's, we're all in institutions where we're moving things, we're moving as well. And some things you just aren't able to do at that time, but you can take the feedback and it's a growth for your own work, right? And for your own team, and you push until things can be in a different place. So absolutely, the humility and listening is critical, especially in this moment.
Yeah, thank you both. And I've heard, that it's a moment, but how do we move it to a movement so that it isn't this one time? And this is kind of what we're getting to in terms of this not just being, a response, but actual transformation, within organizations. And I think both of you are so right on in terms of just the focus on listening, you have the advisory, but even those day-to-day conversations, and recognizing that, that dynamic, that it's really a partnership. Like, you really cannot get the work done. And, it's important to see it being a mutual beneficial partnership in terms of moving forward to address these, issues in communities. And so you both provided some insights in terms of what each of your organizations are doing to advance equity. As I mentioned, obviously this goes beyond, and Shamar, you talked about this a bit, that it's beyond, that it's throughout the organization, and that it took time to get here. that it wasn't something that just happened, like there was some groundwork, there was some work happening. Can you just go a bit further in terms of just explaining, basically, in order to just transform the way both of your organizations are transforming the way equity is advanced and supported, what needs to happen at an institutional level? And this can be yours and just organizations, in case we have other funders watching, what needs to happen at an institutional level to start to make that inward journey to transform your practices and the way you function internally? Was there any assessments done? Like what actually, started that conversation, and really what has to happen?
Rebecca, you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. So, my first day on the job at the Miami Foundation was on June 1st. It was a week after George Floyd was murdered. And we on my first day, we launched our Racial Equity Fund. And we also launched an internal process. And so it's been interesting in listening to you describe what's been a multi-year process, kind of a parallel journey of let us do with the community, and then also let us do internally. And we created internally several committees to do a scrub of our practices. We cannot assert outside and not hold ourselves accountable inside. So thinking about our hiring practices and pay equity and transparency on our own teams, and whether we have leadership in our own organization that represents all of our different constituent groups, and kind of scouring the country for what best practices, and then understanding what is best in class behavior across the board in all of our different functional areas, from the way that we grant to the way that we report to the way that we have relationships with our grantees to where we take money from. So we've been doing some deep assessment and then policy changes for ourselves internally. So it's been work with our leadership, like our board leadership, and work with our team. But I also think it's been for us a live conversation with our community partners. And so one of the things that was really fun this year was that when we launched the Racial Equity Fund, we gave our first round of grants very quickly because there was momentum, there was urgency, it was time to go. And we gave 8 grants to different organizations that are on the front lines doing work related to racial justice in our community. And they did what power building organizations do best. They organized with each other, they got together. Hey, I'm not familiar with your organization. I saw you got a grant, let's all chat. They gathered and they formed what's now called South Florida Racial Justice Table. And they came back to us with a really thoughtful 2-page document that synthesizes best practices from their voices of what the philanthropic community can be doing right now for them. And it was such an important part of our process as an organization to say, like, here's what we're going to compile some funds, we're going to make decisions about these. And for us not to be doing that in an island of decision making by ourselves, and then listening as hard as we can, in informal ways, and then making more decisions internally ourselves, but to be in dialogue with our grantees and with experts in the space to then guide us on what we do next, which then led us to what we did with the round 2 from that fund and what we're going to be doing with round 3 from that fund. So if you haven't seen their document yet, I highly recommend check them out, South Florida Racial Justice Table. But Shamar, I'm really curious to hear what you all have been doing internally.
Yeah, our work really does touch pretty much every part of the foundation. Leadership, obviously, is critical, right? To have your executive leadership, make it a value, make it a commitment. That obviously is a critical piece of the work. But what I will say, just taking a step back, Kresge has 7 national program teams. And when I came to the foundation in 2014, equity was already being expressed in different ways across pretty much all of those program teams. However, there was a push even then, and the push kept getting louder and louder and louder around from the staff across the program teams around us having a more explicit and shared analysis around equities, particularly as an institution that is working to expand opportunity structures, right? In cities, we wanted to really unpack what are the barriers to opportunity, and so that was really a really big drumbeat from the staff, from the ground up staff, to just say we want to be in more communication across. And so it was kind of ground up, top down, right? We had leadership who was committed to it, and there was a strong voice from our staff over years around us deepening our work collectively together. And so what that looks like is both things that have now, that really get into the water of the organization. So we did things, you know, in terms of every single year, all staff retreats, you know, bringing different speakers and having our conversations about race and equity and all of those good things. But I think it was really when we hired Race Forward to come into our institution to do a long, you know, year-plus process from executive team on down, to lead us through a shared collective journey together as an institution, around, you know, race, institutional racism in historical structures, right? Everything from videos on redlining that many people just didn't know, right? It really fascinating to have these shared conversations with the team. So that morphed into, I think I mentioned earlier, a cross-programmatic body of work across the institution. It was called CORE, Kresge Operationalizing Racial Equity. It included, you know, again, team, you know, individuals from across the foundation to look at, similar to you, Rebecca, all the ways, all the different operations across the foundation. And that team then created recommendations on how we would go deeper. They were pilot projects. So looking at how do we, you know, where is our money currently going in our grant making to BIPOC communities, and what are the barriers, right, to move more dollars? How do we look at our vendors when we're convening? Like, who are we hiring in bringing into the organization, but also externally? So it really looked at every single aspect of, and out of CORE, you know, our investment team then had a partnership with AFI around deepening, you know, bringing more women into the investment space. So there's been a lot of results based on just CORE, but now that work has morphed into a broader piece around how do we get deeper? Those were just pilot projects, right? And now we have prioritized where we want to go deeper across vendor work, finance work, you know, grant making. But I also don't want to lose the fact around the cultural space, creating space so people feel safe to have conversations. That, I don't think we can underestimate that. It's critically important. So we would do, you know, things like employee-led, you know, lunch and learns, to full opportunities where our board members came in. We had an amazing panel where 4 women of color on our board came and spoke specifically a really candid conversation about their racial equity journey, both personally and professionally, right? So these are ways in which, again, we brought more of a human aspect to it versus, you know, there's the data, there's the operational piece, but how do we just as humans, as colleagues, right, have a better understanding of what are we talking about and what do we mean, and making sure we're not holding assumptions about what we actually are talking about and what we're not talking about. And I think those are some of the things, those kind of soft pieces around how do you infuse this into the water, creating safe space, creating conversations, bringing your board along, you know, having people share their experiences from a personal perspective, I think are also critically important. And so, yeah, the work continues. We're still, you know, doing lots and lots of things within the foundation to move this work forward. And I'm sorry, the one other thing I would say, I started with this, but organizational values. So Kresge had 6 organizational values, and we added equity as one of them. It seems like a simple thing, but it's a big thing because, again, it's telling our staff, but telling our partners, this is something we value and want to hear from you about how we do it better.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, definitely takes, as you'll just both highlighted, you know, every corner of the organization has to be touched to move forward. So thank you for providing that insight in terms of, you know, the internal process that's underway and continues to be underway to continue to move, you know, in that direction. I have another question for you in regards to something that's has come up, you know, even more so in recent, you know, times in terms of just the way grant making is done. Have your organizations either considered or exploring participatory grant making? And if so, how do you think this could contribute to the self-empowerment of BIPOC communities?
Yes, we are. And I think you are too, Shamar. So, and I'm seeing a lot more participatory processes. I see even related to budgeting happening at the county. Like processes where we're meant to have constituents share what they want before decisions on hire are made that are then given over to them. So the next round of funds that's coming out of our Racial Equity Fund is actually focused in a participatory way. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about as somebody who spends a lot of time leading and working at a nonprofit organization is what I view as, like, you know, I'll say it in a joking way, but it's not a joke, like a philanthropic Hunger Games of sorts, where organizations are pitted against each other as competitors for you know, a scarce pot of resources. And so often questions will be asked, you know, when I was over at an educational organization, you know, why would I fund, what's the difference between you and that other organization? You know, compare yourself, tell me why you're better than them, type of language. And where the pot of funds was treated kind of in a diffused way, I'm going to give each person a grant, and then if they get more, you get less, as opposed to creating a process that facilitates positive, healthy relationships within the ecosystem amongst organizations, creates opportunities for them to work with each other towards shared goals, and also involves them in the shaping of like how much money should be going towards different things. And so what we've been thinking about kind of is system level change. Let's say there's 24 organizations that are working towards, you know, criminal justice reform, or, you know, school to prison pipeline issues. There's many organizations, in some cases, dozens of organizations, many of whom don't know each other, that are working towards similar goals. And if they were to be in a space where they were able to build relationship with each other and have access to a larger set of resources that they can shape together and determine, I understand your role here. We're not necessarily all gonna jump on board and do one big collaborative project, but if I understand which piece you're working on and you understand what piece I'm working on, these dollars, they're different. They're not competitive dollars amongst each other anymore. We're not fighting with each other for these dollars. We're working with each other towards a larger goal, both in terms of our organizations and also in terms of how we leverage our resources. So we're playing around with that right now, which involves a lot of conversations, both between us and grantees and potential grantees, but also between grantees and each other, to ultimately participate in making determinations about how the dollars are spent, which to me seems a lot more sensible than us in a closed room with other decision makers deciding by ourselves.
Yeah, that is really great. Actually, on our environment team, there are examples across the foundation that are teams that are doing some participatory grant making. But in our team, we actually have not yet done participatory grant making with we do again, we have advisory committees that really inform our strategy and inform real time learning around how we execute a strategy. But most oftentimes they don't actually weigh in on the grant making decisions per se. However, it is definitely we see the value of it, and it's something we and our team are trying to explore, like how we might do that differently. I serve and sit on external participatory grant making body of an organization at the Solutions Project. I serve on that, and it's a great model, and I'm so excited to see so many more participatory grant making models within climate philanthropy. We need so much more. It's not nearly enough. But what I find, and we're all learning about the challenges and the benefits of it. But again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. Like, how do we take the lead of the front lines? How do we take the lead of those closest to the problem? And I think that is a really specific and tangible way that we can do that. That shows our partners that we're in partnership with them and we value them and we actually want their decisions to be made, and we want to mitigate this whole Hunger Games piece, because you're right, it's a huge challenge. So I'll stop there, but it's something I'm hoping we can do more of at Kresge.
No, thank you both, and Rebecca, thank you for just highlighting the need for just that, creating that healthy ecosystem, nonprofits, and moving away from that Hunger Game type of, or scarcity model that unfortunately is kind of what dominates just the whole conversation in terms of accessing funds and nonprofits. So just a follow up on that, in terms of, did you indicate that there's an advisory panel that you're working with in terms of how to of grantees, in terms of how to structure the participatory grant making process going forward, or has it been more of just kind of initial conversations with grantees? Like, how is that being structured to even develop that process?
Yeah. So I would say similar to Shamar, we do have community-based and nonprofit-based advisory committees for a variety of different grant programs. But for this program, where we're starting is that we built out a list of every organization that we knew of, and then that many of our advisors, and we asked our whole network and all of our grantees to tell us other organizations that and individuals that we weren't familiar with that were working to solve for racial inequities in our community, built out a many dozens of people and organizations list to then have individual conversations with them. And the next stage from that is group conversations. So bringing organizations and leaders together to have conversations who are solving the same issue. And then we're going to be narrowing from there into 3 specific system level issues that we want to invest in, and to dedicate a larger pot of funds to each of those. It'll either be 2 or 3 issues that we dive into. And then for each of those issues to have a collaborative of sorts of organizations who are working towards solutions with each other, but also separately from each other. And that we want to both invest in the group so that they can build power and relationship and support with each other, but also in their individual missions. And I've been looking at a lot of different models about how this works. We have a different kind of collaborative funding space where everybody involved is kind of chipping in on the same problem and solution with each other. So it's related to music access. We want to see every kid get access to high quality music programs. And so we have 6 organizations that are actually working together with each other to make sure every single kid in Miami Gardens gets access to programming. And their solution is the same one together. They're all delivering it. We don't want in this situation to be forcing organizations to be morphing their solution in order to get access to the dollars. And so what we're looking for is to create an enabling space where they can build power together, where they can share resources with each other, but to allow them to go deeper in the work that they're already doing. So hopefully, Shekeria, that gives you a little bit more into the weeds as to what we're cooking.
No, thank you. Appreciate that. I think we've got some questions that have been coming in through the chat. And so I wanted to, this question is actually directed to you, Rebecca, in terms of just the grant process, wanting to know if your program grants are only available for Miami.
Yes, so our mission is to build a stronger, more equitable Miami. And so for these grants, our community grants program, which just opened up this past week, those grants are focused on Miami related solutions. And then our racial equity fund as well is focused on Miami. There's some organizations that are South Florida regional, and we're funding them as well, and for the work that they do for the region at large and in specific in Miami. We do also house family funds. We have many, many families who house their philanthropic assets with us, and they have priorities outside of Miami that through their donor advised funds we support. But for our kind of discretionary investments, that's Miami focus.
Thank you. I've got another question here, and it's for either one of you or both. So it says language is important. What specific words do you think are important to use? And what do you think about reparations?
Language is important. It's critically important. I think, so when I started off, I was speaking about naming race. I think is really, and I'm not sure exactly what language the question is geared towards, but I think when we talk about supporting BIPOC communities and reducing disparities, I just, I don't think we can shy away from institutional and structural racism. That's just the bottom line, historical, institutional, and structural racism. If we're not naming that, we can go around and talk about diversity and equity and it, right? But if we're not actually putting race at the center, and why in this country in particular, right? And we know all this, the history, the historical context, I think we just have to start there. And then from there, there's we can talk about the systemic pieces of it. But if you were talking about reducing barriers to opportunity, you have to name race, you have to name racism, you have to name the institutional and historical constructs of that in this country before you can, I think, get to any solution set. So that's what I would say. I think that's really important to name. I think reparations is really important. And I love the conversation and that it's been elevated, but I don't think we talk about it enough, to be quite honest. I think You know, we hear it here and there, but I don't think we talk about it in this country quite nearly enough. So that's what I would say.
So I have been delighted over these last few months to see people pay more attention to language here and to see certain terms that used to be less comfortable in the public space being talked about more candidly. And one of those terms I'm seeing used more frequently is white supremacy. I'm seeing it being used colloquially in a way where I think beforehand people only viewed white supremacy as like a Nazi. Like that is a white supremacist, and I think we are now having discussions about systems in our country that are perpetuating inequity and how those systems themselves are perpetuating a white supremacy. And being able to have dialogue about that and unpack that and understand that is really powerful for us as a community. I'm seeing people have discussions about what the difference between racial justice is and inequity and equality and what are each of those things. I think is a really healthy to see so many people trying to figure out. And the thing is, like, once we get right what our terms are, we then will evolve the terms that we use. And so we never quite catch up in this space. But I'm really proud to see how much more comfortable, at least within my space, I'm seeing people are trying really hard to wrap their minds around these different terms. And I think it's not just language choices, like it's a set of values. People are starting to value the discussion differently and to understand their own impact on other people through the words that they choose. And so we were very deliberate in talking about racial equity as opposed to equality, and having conversations about racial justice and understanding where wealth was created and the importance of fixing for systems. And also understanding harm that was done, and that we are not doing some favor to a community by investing. Like harm has been done, and we are making reparation for harm that was done, and also making sure that our portfolios of investment are equitable. And so I think those language choices are important. And I will say, like, I'm beginning for the first time to see real solutions come up related to reparations that I've been waiting to see our country step up in that way or not. And I think we're just beginning to dip our toes in the water of that discussion. I think it was North Carolina earlier this year, there was a commission that approved a reparations process. And it was the first time I'd seen that language in kind of the public discourse. And for people to then look at it and digest what was being said with seriousness. And so if you haven't seen the articles about that and the actual language that was posted, I think that entire bill was really, I think, unanimously approved and beautiful.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And Rebecca, I really appreciate all of that you just shared. And what came up for me when you mentioned, white supremacy is, I think the impact that you mentioned, I always ask myself this, like the so what, right? Meaning, I think it's easy for people to hear different pieces and don't understand exactly what that means. And so when I say the so what, is how do we also unpack the so what? So the so what is the trauma and the harm, right? And so so I just appreciate, there's so many layers to it. And sometimes I think we get tripped up on the language, but even when we name language, it's like, people still don't really connect the dots of like the so what of it, right? And so I think it's also important that we begin to understand the why, right? And the harm that has been done, the trauma that communities still face and are continuing to face. So I just really appreciate you naming and lifting all of the ways in which, why we need to actually name things for what they are.
Oh, thank you both. I have another question here. It's to either you or both in terms of what actions can foundations take to mitigate some of these hurdles so that frontline groups can tap into foundation dollars. You both kind of talked about how your process has changed. So a follow-up question.
Yeah, I really love this question. And what I'll say is, for anyone who's tuned in, you got a bunch of likes on that question over there. If you have suggestions related to this, my email is up on our Miami Foundation website, and I would love to hear from you as well. But this is a lot of the work that we're doing right now, is understanding what the barriers to funding are within our own structures and how we can undo those, and then do that in a very deliberate and visible way so that our colleagues in the funding space follow suit. And so one of the things that we discovered as we were doing racial equity funding, we started asking all of our colleagues across the county, who are the people who are the leaders in your community doing the work to unpack and undo for systemic racism. And a lot of those individuals were considered unfundable within the philanthropic community because they didn't have traditional nonprofit organizations set up, or they didn't have some of the structures necessary with which to apply. So, an 88-year-old grandmother doing work in her neighborhood, or a student in high school doing the work, or a businessman who has launched an initiative out of his own pocket, and they're doing the work because the work needs to be done and because they're the leaders in this moment. And we need to figure out on our end how we can make sure to give resources where resources are needed. And you'll see this, like a lot of GoFundMes pop up in moments of crisis in order to get funds where they need to go in a nimble and fast way. And it has to push upon us as a philanthropic institution. Are we too slow? Are we too unable to move? Are we too disconnected from the community to be able to respond in moments like this, that people are literally inventing pathways around us in order to get to the people who need resources and deserve resources right now? And so what we ended up doing in our racial equity fund was actually doing a round of awards to individuals and figuring out the right way to do that. There are ways to do it, so let's do it. And then also for us to make sure that we're not asking for applications and essays from people in moments of trauma, but finding ways to be nimble, and then also to elevate the profile of our grantees so that other people learn about their work and fund their work in greater amounts, so that we're not just kind of funding behind the scenes, but actually using the grant as an opportunity for increased greatness for the org.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, plus one to everything Rebecca said, ask the question. We have to ask our grantees, what are the barriers, and listen. But as a national funder, one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing is influencing other funders to move their dollars to more, in more equitable ways based on what we're learning as we're doing our learning journey. So just yesterday, the environment team launched there was a pledge, the Donors of Color Network. Some of you may have seen in the media, launched a national climate justice pledge, which is asking for climate philanthropy to commit 30% of their grant making to BIPOC-led communities. Kresge was one of the 7 foundations thus far who was the early adopters and signed on to this, but it is our way of trying to lead and informing and influencing other climate philanthropy to follow suit, knowing the just dismal numbers. So I think there's the ask the question, do your own work, but also try to move and influence and push and bring others along with you.
And Shekeria, I see Courtney Strickland stuck a comment in there to tag on to the question we just answered that I thought was really worthwhile. Can I jump in with a quick answer to her?
Absolutely. Or can you say what the question is too? Yeah, thanks.
So she comment here about organizations being overloaded and participatory grant making for all of its praise. Are we now asking for grantees to step in and take on some of the labor of the philanthropic institutions? And then it's restrictive because only people who have the ability to contribute in that way with their time can receive. And so I'll say amen to that. It's really exhausting to see how much time is asked from nonprofit organizations, especially grassroots organizations, to donate their time as if that's not money in itself, and how strained organizations and leaders are when they're not compensated for their expertise. If I'm asking you for your expertise, I should be compensating you for your expertise. It was very irritating as a kind of consulting professional to see people want to pick my brain for free. It's like, this is what I do for a living. This is what you do for a living. And if I'm asking for you to do the work with me, I want to compensate you for that work. And so we actually, and I see Lindsay's in the conversation as well. Lindsay Linzer over at our organization recently just authored our honorarium policy. If we're asking people for our time, we should be offering an honorarium, making sure your attendance at something, your contribution to something is compensated, so that whether it's paying for childcare or compensating for the fact that if you're not doing the work, somebody else needs to be doing the work, and that costs you. And so for some organizations, that's no big deal. And you have a full-time salary that pays you to just dedicate yourself to engaging in community stuff. But we need to be able to offer that so that our participation is equitable and just lives out our values.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Well, thank you for that. This has been definitely, both of you have just shared, just a variety of just kind of wealth of knowledge in terms of just your experience, and just really appreciate you just being, candid in terms of just how you're thinking through, how your organizations are thinking through these conversations. And want to give this time, since we're getting close to the top of the hour, want to give you each, an opportunity to maybe just share some final thoughts, with our attendees before we have to wrap up the session. So thank you. I don't know, Shamar or Rebecca, whoever wants to start first.
I can jump in. Well, first, I want to just say thank you to Catalyst Miami for hosting the summit and inviting me to the conversation. And so thank you, thank you, thank you. I think Rebecca may have said this, but we have to just be bolder, more creative. I don't, if not now, when? No, it's just in our institutions, we have to figure out a way to take bigger risks, to be bolder, and to follow the folks on the ground. That is the bottom line. I worry so much because when we look at the numbers, the data just doesn't lie. Less than 2%, 1.3% going to the communities we care about. It just doesn't make any sense. And so I'm hopeful. And even in the 6 years I've been in philanthropy, I've seen so much change, and I'm really hopeful around that. I'm hopeful for the moment we're in, but I want to make sure that we're moving from this, that we're not thinking about this as a moment, and that we're really building movements, and that we are taking the lead of front lines, and that we're bringing other institutions along. So whether that's having one-on-one conversations with folks, doing all the things that we are both doing in our institutions, but we need more. We need more, and we got to go farther and faster together. And that's just what I will leave with there. So more like this, more like these two.
Amen. I really loved this conversation. Shekeria, Shamar, it was great to talk to you. I guess I'll throw in two closing thoughts. One is similar to what you just said, Shamar. I think this is a time for courageous leadership, and ideally for unified, humble leadership where we're listening to each other and working with each other. But the other is that I feel like a lot of the conversations that I have related to equity and racial equity are grounded in conversations about trauma and making sure that we don't perpetuate trauma. And it is really important that we go there. But I also think it is really foolish for us to try to solve any problems in community without the full representation of the greatest minds in our community. And so it is not just about not doing more wrong. It is about not being foolish leaders and really tapping into the excellence in our entire community. And so I just wanted to end that there and say, the Black leaders that I have the honor to partner with are doing incredible things for our community, both in terms of strengthening the Black community, but really in terms of making Miami all that it has the potential to be. And I don't want us to view that work as charitable, as if we're doing some favor to those leaders. We are lucky. We are lucky to be able to tap into all the talent in our community, and it has been a mistake that we have underinvested in that way.
Amen.
Thank you both. Thank you, Shamar. Thank you, Rebecca, for your insights and just once again this conversation today. And I also want to thank the attendees, for staying with us and being a part of this conversation. I invite everyone to check out the agenda and join on many of the other exciting panels that are also happening today. So once again, thank you again, and look forward to this conversation continuing in our community.
Thank you all.
Thank you.